Picture this: a stone chamber deep beneath a monastery in 13th century France. The air is thick with incense and something else, something darker. Candlelight flickers across iron instruments, arranged with almost liturgical precision. A man in the brown robes of a Dominican friar approaches a contraption that would make modern minds recoil in horror. Yet he believes, with absolute certainty, that what he's about to do is God's work. Before we descend into this abyss together, I'd love to know where you're listening to this story tonight. Are you safe in your warm bed, perhaps in London, New York, or maybe somewhere in Asia where dawn is breaking? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you find yourself unable to look away from what we're about to uncover, consider subscribing. These stories of human darkness need to be told, lest we forget how far we've come or how far we could fall. Tonight, we're peeling back the sacred veil to reveal one of history's most disturbing contradictions. How did the very institutions that preached love, mercy, and salvation become architects of humanity's most sophisticated instruments of agony? This isn't just a tale of medieval brutality. It's the story of how ordinary men, cloaked in religious authority, transformed divine mission into systematic terror. The tools we'll examine weren't created by bloodthirsty barbarians or pagan warlords. They were designed, blessed, and wielded by monks, friars, and priests who genuinely believed they were saving souls. The irony is so profound it borders on the surreal. To understand how instruments of divine torture came to exist, we must first step into the turbulent world of 13th century Europe. The Catholic Church was facing an unprecedented crisis. Heretical movements were spreading like wildfire across the continent. The Cathars in southern France, the Waldensians in the Alps, and dozens of other groups were challenging the Church's monopoly on salvation. These weren't random rebels or political dissidents. These were deeply spiritual people who simply interpreted Christianity differently. The Cathars, for instance, believed in the fundamental evil of the material world. They practiced extreme asceticism and rejected many Catholic sacraments. To the church hierarchy, this wasn't just theological disagreement. It was an existential threat. Pope Gregory IX, a man whose name would become synonymous with institutional brutality, recognized that traditional methods of combating heresy weren't working. Debate, persuasion, even excommunication seemed powerless against the growing tide of alternative Christian thought. Something more decisive was needed. In February 1231, Gregory issued the papal bull Excommunicamus, a document that would stain the Church's reputation for centuries to come. This wasn't merely a declaration of war against heresy. It was the blueprint for systematic, institutionalized torture in the name of God. The bull prescribed life imprisonment for repentant heretics and execution for those who remained obstinate. But more significantly, it established the framework for what would become the medieval Inquisition. The Pope faced a crucial decision about who would carry out this grim work. Local bishops had proven ineffective, often too connected to their communities to pursue heretics with sufficient zeal. Gregory needed men who were theologically sophisticated, completely loyal to Rome, and emotionally detached from local politics. His choice was as brilliant as it was terrifying. The newly formed mendicant orders, particularly the Dominicans and Franciscans, seemed perfect for the task. These were men who had voluntarily embraced poverty and devoted their lives to preaching and theological study. They moved freely between communities, answering only to Rome. Most importantly, they possessed the intellectual firepower to engage with sophisticated heretical arguments. Saint Dominic himself had spent years preaching to the Cathars in southern France, though he favored persuasion over coercion. Ironically, the order he founded would become infamous for methods he himself never employed. By 1233, just 2 years after the bull's issuance, Dominican inquisitors were operating across Europe with unprecedented authority. The transformation was remarkable and horrifying. Men who had taken vows of humility and service suddenly found themselves wielding power that rivaled kings and princes. They could arrest anyone on suspicion of heresy, confiscate property, and demand testimony from entire communities. Local authorities were obligated to assist them, and resistance meant automatic excommunication. But this power came with a theological problem that would drive the development of increasingly sophisticated torture techniques. How do you force someone to genuinely repent? How do you distinguish between sincere conversion and desperate lies told under duress? The inquisitors believed they had found the answer in the methodical application of pain. The theological gymnastics required to justify torture in Christ's name were extraordinary. Yet the medieval church managed it with disturbing elegance. The fundamental argument rested on a concept that would sound familiar to modern ears trained in doublespeak. They were untorturing people. They were saving souls. The doctrine was elegantly simple and profoundly twisted. The human body was merely a temporary vessel for the eternal soul. If inflicting pain on the flesh could prevent the soul's eternal damnation, then torture wasn't just permissibly, was a moral imperative. The inquisitors saw themselves not as torturers, but as spiritual surgeons, cutting away the cancer of heresy with precise, painful incisions. This reasoning received official papal sanction in 1252, when Pope Innocent IV issued the bull ad expoienda. This document explicitly authorized the use of torture in inquisitorial proceedings, with one crucial caveat that reveals the Church's awareness of its moral contradiction. Torture must not cause death or permanent injury to limbs. Blood must not be shed directly by church officials. This restriction led to a macabre innovation in the history of human cruelty. Inquisitors became masters of inflicting excruciating pain without technically violating their religious constraints. They developed techniques that crushed bones without breaking skin, that dislocated joints without cutting flesh, that brought victims to the very brink of death without crossing that final threshold. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Church officials would design torture sessions with meticulous care, specifying exactly which instruments to use and how much pressure to apply. They would observe the proceedings, taking notes on the victim's responses and deciding when to intensify or pause the torture. But they would not personally operate the devices. That task fell to secular executioners, allowing the priests to maintain the fiction that they kept their hands clean. The psychological torture began long before the physical pain. Accused heretics were brought into the torture chamber and shown the instruments that would be used on them. Each device was explained in detail, its function, its effects, the specific types of agony it would produce. Many victims confessed immediately, preferring to face whatever punishment awaited rather than endure the promised suffering. For those who remained silent, the inquisitors employed a graduated approach. The process typically began with simple intimidation, being stripped of clothing and bound to prepare for torture. If this failed to produce a confession, the torture would begin with relatively mild applications of pain, gradually increasing in intensity until the victim either confessed or lost consciousness. The Church developed elaborate protocols around these sessions. Confessions extracted under torture had to be freely reaffirmed afterward. When the victim was no longer in immediate physical distress, if someone recanted their confession once removed from the torture chamber, they could be subjected to even more severe treatment as a relapsed heretic. Perhaps most disturbing was the genuine conviction among many inquisitors that they were performing acts of mercy. They truly believed that temporary physical suffering was preferable to eternal spiritual damnation. This self-righteousness made them particularly effective torturers, capable of inflicting incredible pain while maintaining absolute moral certainty about their actions. The theological framework they constructed was so sophisticated that it influenced legal thinking for centuries. The idea that extreme circumstances justified extreme measures, that the ends could justify horrific means, that authority figures could make moral calculations beyond the understanding of ordinary people. These concepts would resurface again and again throughout history. The instruments of torture developed by and for religious orders represented a horrifying marriage of medieval engineering and theological purpose. These weren't crude weapons of war or simple tools of execution. They were precisely calibrated machines designed to extract confessions while preserving life, to inflict maximum psychological terror while maintaining the fiction of Christian mercy. The heretic's fork stands as perhaps the most symbolically perfect instrument of religious torture. This deceptively simple device consisted of a double-pronged metal fork attached to a leather collar. The two sharp prongs were positioned so that one pressed into the soft flesh beneath the victim's chin, while the other pierced the sternum. The victim was forced to hold their head in an awkward, upright position. Any movement resulted in the prongs penetrating deeper into their flesh. What made this instrument particularly insidious was its psychological effect. Victims couldn't speak above a whisper, couldn't eat, and couldn't sleep. The only word they could manage to articulate clearly was abjuro, Latin for "I recant," which was often inscribed on the side of the device, as a constant reminder of the confession that would end their suffering. Dominican inquisitors favored this instrument because it aligned perfectly with their theological goals. The victim remained conscious and capable of confession, but was in constant, escalating agony. The device could be worn for days, slowly breaking down the victim's resistance through sleep deprivation and mounting pain. Most importantly, it left no permanent marks and shed no blood, satisfying the Church's technical requirements for merciful torture. The Spanish donkey, or burro espegal, represented a more elaborate approach to religiously sanctioned torture. This triangular wooden beam, often equipped with metal spikes along its apex, was designed to literally split the victim's body in two. The accused was forced to straddle the sharp edge while weights were attached to their legs, gradually increasing the pressure until bones cracked and flesh tore. Inquisition records from Spanish monasteries describe the methodical application of this torture. Priests would carefully calculate the weight needed to produce confession without causing immediate death. They developed charts showing how much weight different body types could endure, how long the torture could continue safely, and which positions produced the most psychological terror. The Spanish donkey was particularly favored for accused witches and heretics who showed unusual resistance to other forms of persuasion. The positioning was deliberately humiliating. Victims were often stripped naked and forced into positions that violated medieval concepts of modesty and dignity. The combination of physical agony and psychological humiliation frequently broke victims who had withstood other tortures. The knee splitter, or leg screw, demonstrated the medieval church's capacity for innovation in the field of human suffering. This device consisted of two wooden boards connected by iron screws. The victim's knee was placed between the boards, and the screws were gradually tightened until bones began to crack. The torture could be precisely controlled. Inquisitors could stop just short of permanent disability, apply pressure in stages to maximize psychological impact, or continue until the joint was completely destroyed. What distinguished the religious use of the knee splitter from its secular applications was the ritualistic precision with which it was employed. Dominican and Franciscan inquisitors developed detailed protocols for its use. They would begin with minimal pressure, allowing the victim to experience the mounting dread of anticipated pain. Prayers were often recited during the process, maintaining the fiction that this was a spiritual rather than purely punitive exercise. Historical records from the Inquisition archives revealed disturbing details about the systematic use of these instruments. In Toulouse, the Dominican Inquisitor Bernard Gouy documented the confession rates associated with different torture methods. His records show that the combination of psychological intimidation and precisely applied physical pain produced confessions in approximately 95% of cases. But these weren't random acts of sadism. Each torture session was carefully planned and documented. Inquisitors maintained detailed records of which instruments were used, how long torture was applied, and what confessions were obtained. They treated torture as a science, constantly refining their techniques to maximize effectiveness while minimizing the risk of accidental death. The religious orders even developed training programs for new inquisitors, teaching them to recognize the optimal moment to apply pressure, how to distinguish between genuine and fabricated confessions, and when to intensify or pause torture for maximum psychological impact. These programs were conducted in monasteries, surrounded by sacred symbols and religious texts, creating a surreal environment where torture techniques were taught as spiritual practices. The efficiency of these methods was terrifying. Experienced inquisitors could extract detailed confessions within hours, often without causing permanent physical damage. They learned to read the subtle signs of psychological breakdown, or to identify the precise moment when a victim's resistance collapsed completely. As the Inquisition evolved, so did its instruments of torture. The religious orders, particularly the Dominicans, developed increasingly sophisticated devices that reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge about human anatomy, psychology, and the precise application of pain. These weren't the crude implements of common executioners. They were the refined tools of men who approached torture as both an art and a sacred duty. The Inquisition Rack, or chevalet, represented the pinnacle of medieval torture technology. Unlike the simple stretching devices used by secular authorities, the ecclesiastical version was a marvel of precision engineering. The victim was bound to a wooden frame with ropes attached to their wrists and ankles. These ropes passed through an intricate system of pulleys and gears that allowed inquisitors to apply pressure with mathematical precision. The genius of the Inquisition Rack lay in its gradualism. The stretching began so gently that victims barely noticed the initial tension. Dominican inquisitors would conduct entire theological debates while slowly increasing the pressure, creating a surreal atmosphere where discussions of divine love occurred while human joints were systematically dislocated. Surviving manuals from Dominican monasteries describe the proper technique in disturbing detail. The torture began with the victim fully clothed and unrestrained, positioned comfortably on the rack, while inquisitors explained the theological errors they needed to confess. Only gradually were the restraints applied, so subtly that many victims didn't realize torture had begun until their joints started to separate. The psychological effect was devastating. Victims experienced mounting dread as they felt their bodies slowly being pulled apart. The anticipation often proved more effective than the actual pain. Many confessed while still experiencing only mild discomfort, terrified by the promise of what was to come. The pair of anguish stands as one of history's most disturbing examples of sexual torture employed for religious purposes. This pear-shaped metal device was inserted into the victim's mouth, rectum, or vagina, then slowly expanded using an intricate screw mechanism. Different sizes were used for different alleged crimes. Smaller versions for blasphemers and liars, larger ones for heretics and accused witches. What made this instrument particularly horrifying was the religious symbolism attached to its use. Inquisitors saw it as a physical manifestation of spiritual corruption. For women accused of sexual misconduct or witchcraft, the insertion of the pair was accompanied by prayers for purification. The expanding metal was described as burning away sin from within, purging the victim's body of diabolic influence. The device was designed to cause maximum terror without immediate death. As the pair expanded, it would tear internal tissues and fracture bones, but the damage was internal and not immediately visible. Victims remained conscious throughout the process, capable of confession and spiritual guidance. The torture could continue for hours, with inquisitors pausing periodically to offer spiritual counsel and opportunities for repentance. The boot, or brodequin, represented perhaps the most systematic approach to religiously sanctioned torture. This iron casing was fitted around the victim's leg and foot, with wooden wedges driven between the metal and flesh using heavy hammers. Each strike was precisely calibrated to crush a specific portion of the limb, without causing immediately fatal injuries. French Dominican monasteries developed elaborate rituals around the use of the boot. The torture began with prayers for the victim's spiritual welfare, continued with theological discussions during the crushing process, and concluded with opportunities for confession and absolution. The combination of excruciating physical pain and promises of spiritual relief created powerful psychological pressure. Historical records from the monastery of Saint-Jacques in Paris detailed the systematic use of the boot during the suppression of the Templar order. Each session was carefully documented, including the number of wedges used, the victim's responses, and the confessions obtained. The monks treated these records as important theological documents, believing they were chronicling the triumph of divine truth over diabolic deception. The head crusher represented the ultimate expression of the medieval church's capacity for rationalized brutality. This device consisted of a metal cap that fitted over the victim's skull, connected to a screw mechanism that applied gradually increasing pressure. As the pressure mounted, victims experienced a progression of horrors. First, severe headaches, then the crushing of teeth and fracturing of the jaw, finally the explosion of the skull itself. What distinguished the ecclesiastical use of the head crusher was the theological framework that surrounded its application. Inquisitors believed that heretical thoughts literally resided in the victim's brain. The crushing process was seen as a physical extraction of diabolic ideas, a literal purging of corrupt thoughts from the seat of consciousness. The torture began with extensive spiritual preparation. Victims were given last rites, offered opportunities for confession, and subjected to hours of theological instruction. The actual crushing process was accompanied by prayers for the purification of the victim's mind and soul. Even as their skulls began to crack, victims were encouraged to confess their errors and accept divine mercy. Bernard Gouy, one of history's most efficient inquisitors, documented over 900 torture sessions during his career. His records reveal the systematic refinement of these techniques over decades of practice. He noted which instruments were most effective for different types of accused heretics, which combination of psychological and physical pressure produced the fastest confessions, and which methods minimized the risk of premature death. Goui's notebooks read like scientific journals, documenting experiments in human suffering with the dispassionate precision of a medieval scientist. He recorded the average time required to break different personality types, the optimal sequence for applying various tortures, and the most effective methods for ensuring that confessions would not be retracted once the torture ended. The efficiency of these refined methods was remarkable and horrifying. Experienced inquisitors could extract detailed confessions from virtually any victim, often within a single session. They developed psychological profiles of different heretical movements, tailoring their torture techniques to exploit the specific fears and beliefs of each group. The physical instruments were only one component of the Inquisition's sophisticated system of psychological torture. The religious orders understood that the mind was often more fragile than the body, and they developed elaborate theatrical productions designed to break their victims' will before any physical pain was applied. The torture chamber itself was a carefully designed stage set. These weren't the dungeon hellscapes of popular imagination, but rather clinical, almost sacred spaces that emphasized the religious nature of the proceedings. Dominican monasteries typically housed their torture chambers directly beneath the chapel, creating a deliberate juxtaposition between divine worship above and human suffering below. The chambers were arranged with liturgical precision. Torture instruments were displayed like altarpieces, polished and arranged in specific orders that corresponded to the gravity of different heresies. Candles provided the only illumination, casting flickering shadows that transformed familiar objects into nightmarish shapes. Crucifixes adorned the walls, forcing victims to confront religious imagery while experiencing agony inflicted in God's name. The psychological torture began with the victim's arrest. Inquisitors deliberately chose dramatic moments during family meals, religious services, or public celebrations. The timing was calculated to maximize community terror while isolating the victim from potential support networks. Entire families would watch as their loved ones disappeared into the inquisitorial system, never knowing whether they would return or how they might be changed. The stripping of victims served multiple psychological purposes beyond the practical need to examine their bodies for evidence of diabolic marks. The removal of clothing stripped away social status, personal identity, and basic human dignity. Wealthy merchants found themselves naked and powerless, reduced to the same vulnerable state as common peasants. The humiliation was often more devastating than physical pain. Women faced particular psychological torments related to medieval concepts of modesty and sexual purity. Female victims were typically examined by male inquisitors who claimed to be searching for witch marks or signs of diabolic intercourse. These examinations were conducted with clinical detachment, creating a disturbing combination of violation and religious authority that left lasting psychological scars. The inquisitors employed sophisticated techniques of psychological manipulation that would unseem out of place in modern interrogation manuals. They alternated between moments of apparent kindness and sudden cruelty, creating emotional whiplash that destabilized their victims' ability to predict or prepare for what was coming next. False promises of mercy were a standard component of the psychological arsenal. Victims were told that confession would result in light penances, perhaps a pilgrimage or period of fasting. They were assured that the Church's only interest was in saving their souls, not in punishment or revenge. These lies were particularly effective because many victims desperately wanted to believe them. The religious orders developed detailed profiles of different personality types and tailored their psychological approaches accordingly. Proud individuals were subjected to elaborate humiliations designed to break their sense of self-worth. Fearful people were threatened with increasingly horrible tortures until their imaginations became their own worst enemies. Deeply religious victims were convinced that their suffering was divine punishment for hidden sins. The timing of psychological pressure was as important as its content. Victims were often kept in solitary confinement for weeks or months before their first interrogation, allowing anxiety and uncertainty to erode their mental defenses. They were deprived of sleep, adequate food, and human contact until their ability to think clearly was severely compromised. When victims were finally brought before the inquisitors, they encountered a carefully orchestrated performance designed to emphasize both the power of the Church and the futility of resistance. Multiple robed figures would be present, creating an impression of overwhelming religious authority. The formal Latin proceedings reinforced the victim's powerlessness while emphasizing the sacred nature of the process. The confession process itself was another form of psychological torture. Victims were unsimply asked to admit their guilt. They were required to provide elaborate details about their alleged crimes, to name accomplices, and describe specific acts of heresy. Those who provided insufficient detail were accused of lying and threatened with renewed torture. Perhaps most disturbing was the genuine conviction among many inquisitors that these psychological techniques were acts of mercy. They believed that breaking someone's will through terror and manipulation was preferable to relying solely on physical torture. They saw themselves as skilled physicians of the soul, using psychological pressure like a surgical instrument to excise spiritual corruption. The long-term effects on survivors were devastating. Those who lived through the inquisitorial process often emerged as broken shadows of their former selves. They had been forced to betray friends and family members, to confess to crimes they hadn't committed, and to publicly renounce beliefs they held sacred. Many never recovered from the psychological trauma, living the remainder of their lives in fear and spiritual confusion. Behind the cold historical records and theological justifications were real human beings whose lives were shattered by the Inquisition's machinery of religious terror. Their stories, preserved in scattered documents and survivor testimonies, revealed the true human cost of institutionalized torture conducted in God's name. The Cathars of southern France were among the first to experience the full brutality of the new inquisitorial system. These peaceful religious communities, who called themselves the perfect, practiced an extreme form of Christianity that rejected violence, oaths, and material possessions. Their commitment to non-violence made them particularly vulnerable to the Dominican inquisitors, who arrived in Languedoc in the 1230s. Pierre Outhier, a Cathar, perfect, captured near Toulouse in 1309, left behind a harrowing account of his interrogation by Dominican inquisitors. Stripped naked and suspended from the ceiling by his wrists, Outhier was subjected to what the inquisitors called gentle questioning. Weights were gradually added to his feet, while monks chanted prayers for his spiritual enlightenment. The psychological torture was perhaps worse than the physical pain. Outhier's captors told him repeatedly that his suffering was unnecessary. All he needed to do was renounce his heretical beliefs and accept the true faith. They described in graphic detail how his current agony was nothing compared to the eternal torments awaiting unrepentant heretics. The combination of immediate pain and promised spiritual relief proved devastating. After 3 days of torture, Outhier confessed to being a Cathar minister and provided the names of other believers in his community. His confession was carefully recorded by a Dominican scribe, who noted the specific tortures that had been applied and the exact moment when the victim's resistance collapsed. Outhier was eventually burned at the stake, but not before his forced testimony led to the arrest and torture of dozens of other Cathars. The case of the Knights Templar provides perhaps the most documented example of systematic torture employed by religious orders. When King Philip IV of France moved against the Templars in 1307, he relied heavily on Dominican inquisitors to extract the confessions needed to justify the order's destruction. Jacques de Malle, the last Grand Master of the Templars, endured months of torture at the hands of Dominican inquisitors in Paris. Initially defiant, de Malle was subjected to a graduated program of physical and psychological pressure designed to break his will without killing him. The process began with simple intimidation, progressed through various forms of physical torture, and culminated in a sophisticated campaign of psychological manipulation. The inquisitors told de Malle that his suffering could end immediately if he would simply admit to the charges against the Templars: heresy, blasphemy, and devil worship. They assured him that his confession would be treated as evidence of repentance rather than guilt, and that he would be allowed to live quietly in retirement rather than face execution. Under this pressure, de Malle eventually confessed to spitting on the cross and denying Christ during Templar initiation ceremonies. His confession was immediately copied and distributed throughout Europe as proof of the order's corruption. However, when de Malle was brought before the Papal Commission in 1310, he dramatically retracted his confession, declaring that it had been extracted through torture and was entirely false. This retraction sealed de Malle's fate. Under inquisitorial law, those who recanted confessions extracted under torture were classified as relapsed heretics and faced mandatory execution. De Malle was burned alive in Paris in 1314, maintaining his innocence to the end. The torture of women accused of witchcraft reveals another dimension of the Inquisition's brutality. Agnes Sampson, accused of witchcraft in Scotland in 1590, was subjected to tortures specifically designed for female victims. The witch's bridle, a metal cage that enclosed her head and featured a sharp iron probe that penetrated her tongue, prevented her from speaking above a whisper while causing excruciating pain with any movement. Sampson was also subjected to sleep deprivation torture, forced to remain awake for days while inquisitors took turns questioning her about her alleged supernatural practices. The combination of physical pain, exhaustion, and psychological pressure eventually led her to confess to an elaborate conspiracy involving devil worship and attempts to kill King James VI through witchcraft. The testimonies of survivors reveal the long-term psychological damage inflicted by inquisitorial torture. Those who escaped execution often lived in constant fear of They had been forced to betray friends and family members, to confess to crimes they hadn't committed, and to publicly abandon beliefs they held sacred. Many survivors reported persistent nightmares, an inability to trust others, and a profound spiritual confusion that lasted for the remainder of their lives. The inquisitors hadn't simply extracted confessions, they had fundamentally altered their victims' understanding of reality, truth, and divine justice. Perhaps most tragically, some survivors internalized the inquisitors' message that their suffering was deserved punishment for hidden sins. They emerged from torture, convinced that they were genuinely guilty of crimes they couldn't remember committing. The psychological manipulation had been so complete that victims became accomplices in their own destruction. Not everyone within the religious orders accepted the Inquisition's methods. Without question, the systematic use of torture created significant tensions within Dominican and Franciscan communities, leading to internal conflicts that revealed the moral contradictions at the heart of the entire enterprise. Some of the most compelling evidence of internal dissent comes from the records of Dominican monasteries in northern France. Brother Thomas of Aversa, a Dominican inquisitor active in the 1250s, abruptly resigned his position after witnessing the torture of a young woman accused of Cathar sympathies. His letter of resignation, preserved in the monastery archives at Saint-Jacques, provides a rare glimpse into the conscience of a medieval torturer. Thomas wrote that he could no longer reconcile his vows of Christian charity with the proselytematic infliction of suffering on fellow human beings. He described watching the torture of innocents, listening to false confessions extracted through unbearable pain, and gradually losing faith in the entire inquisitorial process. His resignation letter includes a haunting passage. "I fear that in seeking to save souls through the destruction of bodies, we have lost our own souls in the process." Thomas was not alone. Records from various Dominican houses show that inquisitor positions had unusually high turnover rates during the height of the torture period. Many monks requested transfers to other duties, citing health concerns or spiritual difficulties with their assignments. Some simply abandoned their posts without explanation, preferring disgrace to continued participation in the torture system. The Franciscan order, initially reluctant to participate in inquisitorial activities, experienced similar internal conflicts. Saint Bonaventure, the great Franciscan theologian, wrote privately about his concerns regarding the use of torture to extract religious confessions. While he never openly challenged papal authority, his private correspondence reveals deep discomfort with methods that seemed to contradict Francis of Assisi's teachings about Christian love and mercy. Even some popes began to express reservations about the extremes to which inquisitorial torture had evolved. Pope Alexander IV, writing in 1260, reminded inquisitors that torture should be used with moderation and only when absolutely necessary for the salvation of souls. This seemingly gentle admonition was actually a response to reports of increasingly brutal torture sessions that were shocking even by medieval standards. Local bishops frequently clashed with inquisitors over jurisdiction and methods. The Bishop of Padoue was formally condemned by Pope Nicholas III in 1279 for his lack of cooperation with Capua inquisitors, but private correspondence suggests that his resistance stemmed from moral objections to their torture techniques rather than jurisdictional jealousy. These internal conflicts created practical problems for the Inquisition's operation. When experienced inquisitors resigned or requested transfers, they had to be replaced with less skilled personnel who often proved less effective at extracting confessions. The high turnover rate also created security concerns, as former inquisitors possessed detailed knowledge of methods and procedures that could potentially be used against the Church. The Dominican order attempted to address these problems through enhanced training programs designed to strengthen the moral resolve of potential inquisitors. These programs included extensive theological instruction about the necessity of torture for spiritual salvation, psychological preparation for witnessing extreme suffering, and practical guidance for maintaining emotional distance from victims. Despite these efforts, the fundamental contradiction between Christian teaching and systematic torture continued to create problems. Some monasteries reported that monks assigned to inquisitorial duties experienced higher rates of mental illness, alcoholism, and requests for transfer to other religious houses. The psychological toll of conducting torture sessions proved difficult even for men who believed they were doing God's work. The internal documents from this period reveal a church struggling to maintain institutional unity while pursuing policies that violated the moral sensibilities of many of its members. The cognitive dissonance was particularly acute among the mendicant orders, whose founders had emphasized poverty, humility, and service to others. Perhaps most tellingly, the Church began to rely increasingly on secular authorities to conduct the actual torture, while maintaining the fiction that religious personnel were not directly involved. This arrangement allowed inquisitors to design and oversee torture sessions, while avoiding the spiritual contamination of personally inflicting violence. This evolution toward indirect participation represented a tacit acknowledgement that there was something fundamentally wrong with the entire enterprise. If torture was truly a holy act of spiritual healing, why did the Church feel compelled to distance itself from its direct application? The answer lay in the growing recognition that systematic torture was incompatible with authentic Christian witness. Regardless of the theological justifications that had been constructed to support it, the torture techniques pioneered by medieval religious orders didn't disappear with the decline of the original Inquisition. Instead, they evolved and spread, influencing legal systems and interrogation methods across Europe for centuries to come. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, represented the most systematic application of these earlier innovations. The Spanish institution took the Dominican techniques and refined them further, creating an industrial-scale system for extracting confessions and eliminating religious dissent. The famous auto de fe ceremonies were carefully choreographed public spectacles designed to demonstrate the power of religious orthodoxy while terrorizing potential dissidents. Spanish inquisitors inherited detailed manuals describing the torture techniques developed by their medieval predecessors. These documents, preserved in various Spanish archives, reveal how methods originally designed for individual cases were systematized for mass application. The Spanish added their own innovations, including more sophisticated psychological techniques and improved instruments designed for greater efficiency and intimidation value. The influence extended beyond Spain. Portuguese, Italian, and other European inquisitions all drew upon the foundational work of the medieval Dominican and Franciscan torturers. The techniques were exported to the New World, where they were used against indigenous peoples suspected of practicing traditional religions alongside imposed Christianity. One of the most disturbing aspects of this legacy was how torture techniques, originally developed for religious purposes, gradually migrated into secular legal systems. The principle that pain could extract truth became embedded in European jurisprudence, influencing criminal justice procedures well into the modern era. The French legal system maintained judicial torture until 1788, just 1 year before the Revolution. The English, despite their historical resistance to systematic torture, employed similar techniques during periods of religious and political crisis. The methods pioneered by medieval monks became standard tools of state power across the continent. Even more troubling was the preservation and romanticization of these techniques in popular culture. Beginning in the 19th century, a peculiar form of historical tourism emerged around former Inquisition sites. Museums of torture opened in cities like Toledo, Nuremberg, and Carcassonne, displaying instruments of medieval religious torture as historical curiosities. Many of these museums presented sanitized versions of history that emphasized the exotic cruelty of past eras, while downplaying the religious context that had made such systematic torture possible. The complex theological justifications were reduced to simple narratives about medieval barbarity versus modern enlightenment. This selective historical memory served to obscure the most important lessons of the Inquisition era. By focusing on the instruments themselves, rather than the institutional structures that created and sanctioned them, modern audiences could safely distance themselves from the uncomfortable reality that systematic torture had been conducted by educated, morally serious people who genuinely believed they were serving a higher purpose. The historiographical legacy was further complicated by deliberate falsifications and exaggerations. 19th-century anti-Catholic writers, particularly in France, created fictional accounts of inquisitorial practices that were more sensational than the already horrific historical reality. These fabricated stories became embedded in popular consciousness, making it difficult to distinguish between documented historical facts and inflammatory propaganda. The famous Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, for instance, was actually invented by a German philosopher in 1793 as a fictional historical artifact. No such device existed during the medieval period, yet it became one of the most recognizable symbols of inquisitorial torture in popular imagination. These historical distortions had serious consequences for understanding the real lessons of the Inquisition era. By creating mythical narratives about uniquely medieval barbarity, later generations avoided confronting the uncomfortable truth that sophisticated, well-educated people could rationalize systematic torture when provided with appropriate ideological frameworks. The psychological techniques developed by religious inquisitors proved even more durable than their physical instruments. The methods of systematic isolation, sleep deprivation, psychological manipulation, and graduated pressure became standard components of modern interrogation procedures. Intelligence agencies and police forces around the world adopted techniques pioneered by medieval monks, often without acknowledging their historical origins. The American CIA's Cold War interrogation manual, for instance, contained recommendations that would have been familiar to any Dominican inquisitor. Isolation from social support, manipulation of time and environment, exploitation of individual fears and weaknesses, and the careful application of psychological pressure to break down resistance. The connection wasn't coincidental. Many of the psychologists and interrogation specialists who developed modern enhanced interrogation techniques had studied historical torture methods, including those employed by religious orders. They understood that the medieval inquisitors had been surprisingly sophisticated in their understanding of human psychology and the systematic application of pressure to overcome resistance. Perhaps most disturbing was the persistence of the fundamental justification used by medieval religious torturers. The idea that extreme methods are acceptable when employed for sufficiently important purposes, whether the goal was saving souls from eternal damnation or protecting national security from terrorist threats, the underlying logic remained essentially unchanged. The institutional structures that enabled systematic torture during the Inquisition era also provided blueprints for later atrocities. The combination of moral certainty, bureaucratic efficiency, and diffused responsibility that characterized the medieval system reappeared in various forms throughout subsequent history. Modern scholars have identified clear parallels between inquisitorial procedures and the methods employed by totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. The techniques of systematic dehumanization, psychological manipulation, and bureaucratized violence pioneered by religious orders influenced the development of state terror systems centuries later. The documentation obsession of medieval inquisitors, their careful records of torture sessions, confession procedures, and execution statistics, established precedents for the administrative approach to mass violence that would characterize later genocidal regimes. The idea that systematic cruelty could be managed through proper procedures and documentation became embedded in institutional culture. The legacy extends into contemporary debates about torture and interrogation. When modern intelligence agencies argue that enhanced interrogation techniques are necessary for national security, they echo arguments first articulated by medieval religious authorities. When politicians claim that extreme methods are justified by extreme circumstances, they invoke reasoning perfected by Dominican and Franciscan inquisitors. Understanding this historical continuity is crucial for recognizing how easily civilized societies can slide into systematic barbarism when provided with appropriate justifications. The medieval religious orders weren't uniquely evil or primitive. They were educated, morally serious people who convinced themselves that torture served a higher purpose. The instruments themselves have largely disappeared, gathering dust in museums or existing only as historical curiosities. But the ideas that created them, the institutional structures that sanctioned them, and the psychological techniques that made them effective continue to influence human behavior centuries after the last As we emerge from this journey through one of humanity's darkest chapters, we must confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of moral progress and the persistence of institutional evil. The story of religious torture during the Inquisition era isn't simply a tale of medieval barbarity that we can safely consign to the distant past. It's a case study in how ordinary people can become complicit in systematic cruelty when provided with appropriate ideological frameworks. The men who designed and operated these instruments of torture weren't monsters in any conventional sense. They were educated, devout individuals who genuinely believed they were serving the highest possible purpose. They had devoted their lives to spiritual pursuits, taken vows of poverty and service, and committed themselves to the salvation of human souls. Yet they became architects of systematic terror. This paradox forces us to confront the inadequacy of simple moral categories. We prefer to believe that evil is easily recognizable, that torturers are obviously depraved individuals driven by sadistic impulses. The reality is far more disturbing. Evil often comes disguised as righteousness, wearing the robes of moral authority and speaking the language of noble purpose. The theological justifications employed by medieval religious torturers weren't crude rationalizations constructed after the fact. They were sophisticated intellectual frameworks developed by brilliant minds wrestling with genuine moral dilemmas. The question of whether temporary suffering is justified to prevent eternal damnation wasn't obviously absurd to people who believed absolutely in the reality of heaven and hell. This recognition doesn't excuse or minimize the horror of what these men did, but it does complicate our understanding of how such horrors become possible. The danger lies not in obvious evil, but in the human capacity for moral self-deception when combined with institutional authority and ideological certainty. The progression from spiritual mission to systematic torture wasn't sudden or dramatic. It occurred through a series of small compromises, each seemingly justified by circumstances and precedent. The first torture session was probably conducted reluctantly by men who genuinely believed they had exhausted all other options. But each subsequent session became easier to justify until torture became routine administrative procedure. This pattern of gradual moral corruption appears repeatedly throughout history. People don't suddenly decide to become torturers. They drift into it through a series of incremental steps, each individually defensible but collectively devastating. The institutional structures that enable this drift, hierarchical authority, bureaucratic procedures, and ideological justification, remain present in contemporary society. The efficiency of the inquisitorial system is perhaps most troubling aspect of this history. The medieval religious orders didn't just stumble into systematic torture, they perfected it. They developed training programs, wrote instructional manuals, and conducted research to optimize their techniques. They treated torture as a professional skill requiring education, practice, and continuous improvement. This bureaucratization of cruelty represented a fundamental shift in the nature of evil. Previous forms of torture had been largely individual affairs, driven by personal anger, revenge, or sadistic impulses. The religious orders created something new: systematic, institutional torture, conducted by trained professionals following established procedures. The psychological impact on the torturers themselves provides another important lesson. Many of the inquisitors who resigned from their positions did so not because they suddenly recognized the immorality of their actions, but because they could no longer psychologically handle the stress of conducting torture sessions. The human capacity for inflicting suffering, even when sanctioned by authority and justified by ideology, has natural limits. Understanding these limits is crucial for contemporary discussions about torture and extreme interrogation techniques. The medieval evidence suggests that systematic torture corrupts not only its victims, but also its practitioners. Societies that institutionalize torture inevitably face the problem of managing personnel who have been psychologically damaged by their participation in systematic cruelty. the long-term institutional costs are equally significant. Organizations that employ systematic torture often find that the methods eventually turn inward, as torture techniques developed for external enemies are gradually applied to internal dissidents. The medieval church experienced this phenomenon as inquisitorial methods originally designed for heretics were eventually used against reformers within the Inquisition itself. Perhaps most importantly, the Inquisition era demonstrates how quickly moral progress can be reversed when societies face perceived existential threats. The same institutions that had previously emphasized mercy, forgiveness, and spiritual healing rapidly transformed into engines of systematic terror when they felt their survival was at stake. This historical pattern should inform contemporary debates about emergency powers, enhanced interrogation techniques, and the suspension of civil liberties during crisis periods. The medieval precedent suggests that institutional safeguards against torture and other forms of systematic cruelty are more fragile than we might prefer to believe. The study of historical torture also reveals the importance of maintaining skepticism toward claims of moral necessity made by authority figures. When institutions argue that extreme methods are required by extreme circumstances, when they claim that the ends justify horrific means, when they invoke higher purposes to rationalize systematic cruelty, these are precisely the moments when historical vigilance becomes most crucial. The voices of the victims, preserved in scattered testimonies and court records, remind us that behind every policy decision, every institutional procedure, every ideological justification, there are individual human beings whose lives are shattered by the machinery of systematic violence. Their suffering wasn't abstract or theoretical. It was immediate, personal, and devastating. These voices demand that we remember not just the facts of historical torture, but its human cost. They require us to maintain emotional as well as intellectual engagement with these difficult histories, and they challenge us to remain vigilant against the institutional and ideological conditions that make such systematic cruelty possible. The instruments of torture have largely vanished, but the ideas that created them persist. The challenge for contemporary society is learning to recognize these ideas in their modern forms and developing the moral courage to resist them before they gain institutional power. The medieval precedent suggests that this resistance must begin early, before crisis conditions create pressure for extreme measures. As we close this exploration of humanity's capacity for rationalized cruelty, we're left with questions that have no easy answers. How do we balance legitimate security concerns with protection of human dignity? How do we maintain moral clarity in the face of genuine threats? How do we prevent the gradual erosion of ethical standards that characterize the drift toward systematic torture during the Inquisition era? These questions don't have simple solutions, but they demand our continued attention. The study of historical torture isn't an academic exercise in medieval barbarism. It's an ongoing investigation into the moral challenges that continue to face contemporary society. The monks and friars who created these instruments of agony believed they were protecting civilization from existential threats. Their example reminds us that good intentions, institutional authority, and moral certainty provide no guarantee against the systematic perpetration of evil. In our modern world, where new technologies create unprecedented possibilities for surveillance, control, and systematic pressure, the lessons of the Inquisition era remain urgently relevant. We live in societies with the technical capacity to implement systematic cruelty on scales that would have amazed medieval torturers. Whether we develop the moral wisdom to refrain from using these capabilities may determine whether future generations will look back on our era with the same horrified fascination that we now bring to the study of medieval religious torture. The choice, as always, is ours. The instruments change, but the fundamental moral challenges remain constant. The question isn't whether we have the power to inflict systematic suffering on our fellow human beings. Clearly, we do. The question is whether we have the wisdom, courage, and institutional resilience to choose a different path. The victims of the Inquisition, speaking across the centuries through their preserved testimonies, offer us a simple message. Remember what we suffered, understand how it became possible, and do everything in your power to prevent it from happening again. Their voices, echoing from the torture chambers of medieval monasteries, remain our most powerful defense against the return of systematic, institutionalized cruelty. In remembering their suffering, we honor their humanity. In understanding the conditions that made their suffering possible, we equip ourselves to recognize similar dangers in our own time, and in committing ourselves to preventing such systematic cruelty from recurring, we transform their tragic legacy into a source of moral strength for future generations. The instruments of torture invented by religious orders represent more than historical curiosities or examples of medieval barbarism. They stand as monuments to human capacity for moral self-deception, institutional corruption, and the systematic rationalization of cruelty. But they also represent something else: the resilience of human dignity in the face of systematic assault, and the power of historical memory to serve as a bulwark against the repetition of past horrors. As long as we remember their stories, the victims of religious torture haven't died in vain. Their suffering becomes a warning, their testimony becomes a shield, and their memory becomes a sacred trust that we pass down to future generations. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson of this dark chapter in human history, that remembering the worst of which we're capable is the first step toward becoming capable of something better. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey through one of history's darkest chapters. If this exploration has moved you, challenged you, or simply held your attention, please consider subscribing for more investigations into the hidden corners of human experience. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and let me know what other forgotten stories you'd like to see brought to light.